Okay, so you may hear some people in the background. My office has very thin walls, so there's some people talking in the background, so apologize for that, but I want to get started. So I am going to share my screen with you. Hold, please. It's lecture 9. Okay, so here's my screen. You'll see me just kind of leaving slides minimized so I can take notes on them. So I'm going to add notes here like I would write on the board. So follow along with me. This is Exercise Physiology 1. So we're going to start by talking about, in this particular unit or lecture, the aerobic system. So the cardiovascular exercise and how your body adapts not only to a single bout of exercise, but exercise over time. So chronic exercise training. So if I say a single bout of exercise, I mean just one bout, like going for a run one time, or going, riding a bike for 20 or 30 minutes. So we're going to start with some background information on energy systems and then talk about how those energy systems adapt, and then talk about how your body adapts to exercise, again, both acute and chronic. So if you want to define a couple things to start, we have one bout of exercise is one session. Chronic exercise is over time. So think adaptation. And then what else did I say? These energy systems, cardiovascular exercise, like single bout, one session of something like running, cycling, swimming. So this is all cardiovascular exercise. Chronic exercise is think adaptation over time. So in saying that, we've got energy systems that are producing ATP, and these energy systems work together to produce ATP, but they're all working at one time, but the energy systems can produce more ATP depending on the type of exercise that we're doing and how long we're doing that exercise. So these three energy systems, where your immediate energy system, your anaerobic glycolytic system, and your oxidative system, they are all working together to produce ATP. Now, something I may ask you to think about in class would be something like these energy systems. They're producing ATP, but there's positives and negatives, pluses and minuses to using each energy system. Like the immediate energy system, it's an anaerobic system. So if you're thinking anaerobic, when I want you to think anaerobic, I want you to think a couple things. Anaerobic means without oxygen, but also anaerobic type of activities is sprinting, weightlifting, or any activity you can complete in less than about a minute and a half. So an anaerobic activity, those activities are completed in less than a minute and a half at a high intensity. So think sprinting and weightlifting, very high intensity exercises. And you've got two energy systems that are contributing to ATP production to fuel those activities. Your immediate energy system, it's also called your ATP PCR system, your phosphagen system. It's your major fuel source of ATP. And by fuel, I mean ATP. For exercise that lasts less than 30 seconds. So in the first 30 seconds, 10 to 30 seconds of exercise, your ATP that's being produced is predominantly, not only, but predominantly coming from this particular energy system. Now, the energy system is producing ATP predominantly in this first 30 seconds, but it can only produce so much. So it needs help. So these three energy systems work together to produce ATP so that to make sure that your exercising muscle always has enough ATP to do the job that you're asking it to do, to exercise. So when this energy system gets depleted and can no longer continually produce enough ATP to sustain the work that you're doing, then the anaerobic glycolytic system kicks in. And it's also anaerobic, so there's no oxygen necessary for this system to run. It's also called your lactic acid system, or just glycolysis. it's your major fuel source. So again, ATP, major ATP source for maximal exercise lasting 20 seconds up to 3 minutes. So think anaerobic is anything that can be completed in less than 1.5 to 3 minutes. Let me modify that. And I'll talk about why 3 minutes as we go. So again, this isn't your only ATP source, but it's the major ATP source. So I'm going to do this and highlight major ATP source in both spots. Major ATP source. Not only, but major ATP source for exercises lasting 20 seconds to about 3 minutes. There's a little bit of overlap in systems. Now your oxidative system or your aerobic glycolytic system is your major fuel source for any exercise lasting more than 3 minutes. So think longer intensity, aerobic exercise is, spell exercise right. The exercise is with oxygen, or it relies upon oxygen to produce ATP. And for example, is long distance running, cycling, swimming. Those are the big examples I always use. But it can be anything that's an aerobic or cardiovascular sport. Those three are just the ones that come to mind. So those systems, again, lasting 3+ minutes. This aerobic or oxidative system produces a lot of ATP, but it takes time to get to the point where that system is able to produce that tons of ATP. So we'll talk about why that's relevant and what that means here shortly. So this slide is just showing you that all of these systems are working at any given time. So the ATP PCR system is producing ATP at the same time as anaerobic glycolysis and the same time as the oxidative system. However, the predominant source of that ATP, the major source of ATP, how much ATP is being contributed to allowing the exercising muscle to do work, comes from different systems depending on how much time and the intensity of the exercise. So how quickly do you need ATP? So how fast do you need ATP produced? Faster equals ATP PCR and anaerobic systems. Slower ATP production can rely on oxidative systems. But these systems are always working together. Always working to produce ATP, but one system predominates to contribute ATP for exercise. Oh, big deal. Let's talk about these energy systems. The energy system, the phosphocreatine system, or the ATP PCR system, basically phosphocreatine is this system. I don't know what those are there. Those are old notes. Your ATP is phosphocreatine, and creatine produced from the liver, shuttled to the muscle, and a phosphate gets attached to it. There's this enzyme called creatine kinase that can move this equation in either direction. So this creatine kinase is this enzyme that helps convert creatine from its phosphated to phosphorylated to unphosphorylated state. And that enzyme, as it does that, it produces our energy molecule. So it uses phosphocreatine, takes the phosphate off of creatine and attaches it to ADP to produce ATP. And that happens really quickly. So the liver creatine that's produced gets sent to the muscle to create phosphocreatine. That's then stored in the muscle until your muscle needs it. So there's a couple of reasons why you've got phosphocreatine. PCR is phosphocreatine. You have it there stored to donate the phosphate, basically. So in the first 10 to 15, 10 to 30 seconds of exercise, your body, your energy systems, like your anaerobic energy systems and your aerobic energy systems, aren't producing ATP fast enough to keep up with exercise. So this immediate energy system is called the immediate energy system because it easily and immediately produces ATP. So fast ATP. So you get ATP production really quickly. And that ATP production is that the fast production of ATP is really good so that you always have a source of ATP available at the start of exercise. But you only produce 1 ATP per phosphocreatine molecule. So small amounts of ATP are produced. So the benefit to this, using your body's use of this energy system to produce ATP, is that it produces ATP quickly. The negative to it is that it doesn't produce a lot of ATP. So the stores of phosphocreatine and the ability of this system to produce energy is limited. The other thing that this energy system does is restores ATP stored in the muscle. You don't store a lot, small amounts of ATP. You don't store a lot of ATP, but there's a tiny, tiny bit stored. So to replenish that small amount of ATP, your ATP PCR system does that as well. So there's a couple roles that this system plays. One is to provide that tiny amount of stored ATP, but also donate ATP, produce ATP, not donate, during the first 10 to 30 seconds of exercise. Now, at 30 seconds of exercise, your PCR stores are depleted. The only way to replete is to rest. So think when you are strength training, when you do a set of exercise, you do a set of bench press, you do a set of 10. If you get to the point where you're depleting your ATP, your PCR stores, the only way to replete them and resynthesize phosphocreatine is to rest completely. So while you're resting between sets, you're technically just repleting, rephosphorylating creatine. So that is the kind of the negatives to that energy system, as opposed to the positives. Now with anaerobic glycolysis, you produce a little bit more ATP, which is a good thing. Produces more ATP than ATP PCR system. Whoops. Which is good. So that's a good thing. You're producing ATP a little bit more than your ATP PCR, and you're still producing ATP quickly. And that's compared to aerobic glycolysis. So the benefits here are you're producing ATP fast, just like the benefit to the ATP PCR system. And this now produces a little bit more ATP per glucose, more ATP. Now the fuel source for your ATP PCR system back here is phosphocreatine. So phosphocreatine from the liver is the fuel for this energy system to produce ATP. So ultimately the goal of all of these energy systems is to produce ATP. They use different fuels to do that, and by converting that fuel eventually to an ATP molecule or several. The fuel here, anaerobic glycolysis, is glucose and only glucose. There is no other fuel source for anaerobic glycolysis. It happens in the cytosol, not the mitochondria. So it's happening outside of the mitochondria, where you're converting glucose to a molecule. Glucose gets converted to something called pyruvate, and pyruvate gets converted to lactic acid or lactate. So the end product, I wonder if this will let me bold this, it will. It's the end product of anaerobic glycolysis. Glycolysis. There we go. So that end product is important because that lactic acid or lactate, if it gets built up, can cause some acidity inside the muscle. And that acidity, the muscle doesn't really like that. So that's one factor that can cause fatigue in anaerobic exercises. And those, remember, those anaerobic exercises are something that, like, anaerobic exercise is sprinting, jumping, agility type exercises, potentially could be some weightlifting. Now, if you really think your immediate energy system, these systems in the first, I mean, think about how long it would take you to perform an exercise that only lasts 30 seconds. It's more like examples where this system provides most ATP would be something like weightlifting. Think creatine supplementation, where individuals who consume creatine from like a protein powder or like a powder form are able to do more work and lift more weight by basically saturating their muscle with creatine. So those a perfect example of when the phosphocreatine system would donate the majority of the ATP for a particular type of exercise or length of exercise would be something like weightlifting. You can perform that bout of exercise in 10 to 30 seconds. Now, anaerobic exercise that lasts 3 minutes, and that value, that 3 minutes is a really important value. We'll talk about why when we get on the next slide. But basically sprinting, jumping, think sports, athletics, where you're kind of transitioning from anaerobic to aerobic, to high intensity exercise, interval training, high intensity interval training, things like that. So just for a couple examples, think of an exercise that you can perform and sustain sustainable for 30 seconds to 3 minutes. So a lower intensity exercise than weightlifting, than ATP PCR, but higher intensity still than aerobic activities. So jumping, sprinting, something that would last you 30 seconds to 3 minutes. Think of a maximal effort that could last 30 seconds to 3 minutes. Now this system, because the immediate energy system has limitations, it can only provide ATP for about the first 30 seconds of exercise. So after that first 20 to 30 seconds of exercise, when your PCR stores are depleted, you now need a source of ATP. So the anaerobic glycolytic system kind of kicks in and says, okay, here, I can do this. Here's my ATP that I can produce and can contribute to exercise. So even if you're performing an anaerobic sport or activity like sprinting that maybe lasts 2 minutes, in the first 30 seconds of that sprint. So for example, sprint lasting 2 minutes. Or, I don't know, sprint lasting 1 minute, for example. So think about as hard and as fast as you can run for 1 minute. That sprint in the first 30 seconds, most ATP is being produced by way of ATP PCR. Then in that second 30 seconds, the anaerobic systems predominate. So in that first 30 seconds, your anaerobic system hasn't kicked up enough. It hasn't increased ATP production enough to sustain the activity that you're doing. So your ATP PCR system is doing the job of producing most of the ATP. Anaerobic glycolysis is still producing ATP. So in the first 30 seconds of exercise, anaerobic and aerobic glycolysis are producing ATP, just not enough to sustain the exercise activity. If there isn't enough ATP, then muscle stops working, right? So there has to be enough ATP there. So anaerobic and aerobic glycolysis are producing ATP in the first 30 seconds of exercise, but it's not enough to sustain that activity. So you have to rely upon your ATP PCR system to produce more ATP than the other two systems can handle at that moment to sustain exercise. Now, once your ATP PCR stores are depleted in that first 30 seconds of exercise, now your anaerobic glycolytic system has had time to start producing more ATP and can take over as the predominant ATP production source. So that's where this kicks in. Now, it's still producing ATP quickly, but still not a lot of ATP. So let's go back up here. Produces more ATP than your ATP PCR system, and it's still producing ATP quickly compared to aerobic glycolysis, but it does not produce a lot of ATP. Only 2 to 3 ATP per glucose molecule. Now I say 2 to 3 because it depends on the source. If glucose is coming from blood glucose, it needs to be phosphorylated first, and that phosphorylation step just requires 1 ATP. So the net production of ATP is only 2. If that source of glucose is coming from glycogen, remember glycogen is our glucose storage molecule. You store it in muscle and liver, skeletal muscle particularly. If that source is coming from glycogen, that glycogen as glucose is removed from glycogen, it's already phosphorylated. So it just gets cleaved off of glycogen in its phosphorylated state. So in that instance, you get 3 ATP. Was that in parentheses? No. Okay. I'm just going to continually hit save a couple times throughout. So give me a second to do that so I don't lose all my notes, because I'm going to post this. I will post this this version of the PowerPoint with all my notes on it in e-learning as well. So moving on. So a couple of positives about this anaerobic glycolytic system. Produces ATP quickly compared to aerobic glycolysis. And it does produce a little bit more ATP than your ATP PCR system per glucose molecule, but it still doesn't produce a lot of ATP, only 2 or 3 per glucose. So there's a negative there. Also, the end product is lactate, like we said a little bit earlier, which can cause acidity in muscle, and that can lead to fatigue. That's one way that muscles can fatigue. So there's a negative there as well, which is why we now have the aerobic glycolytic system. Now this system is a system that just takes time to start producing a lot of ATP. You need oxygen. And at the start of exercise, you don't have enough. So let's think about why. At the start of exercise, you don't just immediately start sending a perfect amount of oxygen to your muscle to sustain exercise aerobically. It takes time. It takes time to get enough O2 to the muscle to run aerobic glycolysis. That time is about 2 to 3 minutes. In that 2 to 3 minutes, a lot is happening. Heart rate and stroke volume are increasing, which means cardiac output increases, which means blood pressure increases, which means, and in addition to that, ventilation increases. A bunch of things increase. We'll talk about a lot of those things as we go, but all of those increases occur to increase oxygen delivery to the muscle. So all that has to happen. It just takes time for all of that to happen. So at the start of exercise, the first 2 to 3 minutes of exercise, predominantly ATP production is coming from your anaerobic pathways, ATP PCR system and anaerobic glycolysis, because the aerobic system isn't sufficiently producing ATP. It takes time. So aerobic means with oxygen, the major source of ATP during exercises that last more than 3 minutes. So any exercise that's sustainable beyond 3 minutes is aerobic, because that's the time it takes to, I'm going to say, become aerobic. And becoming aerobic means increasing heart rate, increasing blood pressure, increasing cardiac output, ventilation increases. All of that is to ensure that enough oxygen is getting to the muscle, just enough oxygen is getting to the muscle to sustain the work that you're doing, the exercise intensity that you're doing. So you will deliver and consume only enough oxygen to sustain the workload, the work that you're doing, the work that's called exercise intensity you're performing. You won't consume or deliver, you won't send more oxygen to the muscle than it needs, and you won't send not enough. So your body is really good at increasing heart rate to a particular point, or increasing cardiac output, blood pressure. Everything that increases during exercise, it only increases to a certain point. And that certain point is the point at which you're sufficiently delivering oxygen to the muscle. So it's using as much as it needs to sustain activity. Now, in terms of the fuel source, we talked about fuel sources of the ATP PCR system being phosphocreatine. The fuel source of anaerobic glycolysis is glucose. Now, when it comes to aerobic glycolysis, there's some benefits to this. The aerobic glycolysis can use basically any fuel source. Glucose is the big one from glycolysis. We said earlier that the final product of anaerobic glycolysis in a cytosol is lactic acid. As glucose gets converted to pyruvate, pyruvate gets converted to lactate. Now, if aerobic metabolism is sufficiently running, that's no longer the case. Glucose gets converted to pyruvate, yes, still, but pyruvate gets shuttled to the mitochondria and converted to acetyl-CoA, which then heads into the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain to produce lots of ATP. And that lots of ATP just kind of depends on, actually it's about 33 to 36 ATP per glucose molecule. So way more ATP produced. Now, not only is there way more ATP produced, that's a huge benefit to using aerobic glycolysis to produce ATP, but glucose can be used as a fuel source, but so can fatty acids. And I'll just refer to them as free fatty acids, FFA, free fatty acids, or amino acids. Those are all fuels. And really, glucose is only a fuel source if pyruvate gets converted to acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria, but free fatty acids can also be converted to acetyl-CoA. If fatty acids can be converted to acetyl-CoA, there's no way fatty acids can be involved in or a fuel source for anaerobic glycolysis. The only fuel for anaerobic glycolysis is glucose. These three fuels can be used for ATP production aerobically. And there's a figure here to kind of summarize that. So we've got glycogen here as a source of glucose, or blood glucose, right? Undergoing glycolysis. Some amino acids can be converted to pyruvate, not a lot. And you really won't use amino acids unless you're starving. because they're used to make proteins, which your body desperately needs for a lot of different things. But here's the source. Right there's fatty acids get converted to acetyl-CoA. There's a conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA from glycolysis here. Right there's lactate getting produced in the cytosol. So in this blue is the mitochondria. And then here's some more amino acids that kind of make their way into this. It's the citric acid cycle, which is the Krebs cycle, right? So if you're thinking about in a resting individual, why would you, in an arresting individual at rest, you are highly aerobic. So you're using a combination of glucose and fatty acids. Let's go FFA to be consistent as fuel. Now think about it. You've got storage depots of glycogen, right? This storage depot of glycogen in two tissues, muscle and liver, and that's it. If you only have two storage depots for glycogen, every other tissue in the body, like your heart, your brain, lungs, kidneys, all of those organs rely on blood glucose as a fuel source for glycolysis, because they don't have glycogen. So your muscle is really good at using free fatty acids as a fuel source. And the major benefit to this is to spare blood glucose for the organs that don't have glycogen. So your muscle is very needy. It is very highly metabolically active. And because of that, it needs a lot of ATP. So if it needs a lot of ATP and it starts using blood glucose can drop pretty dramatically and very quickly if you're not trying to preserve it. To try to preserve it, you use glycogen. And the first glycogen source in the muscle is intramuscular glycogen. So the muscle's really good at using glycogen to spare blood glucose. So it does that. But by using another fuel source, free fatty acids, you can also spare glycogen. So using free fatty acids spares glycogen, which spares blood glucose, which basically means you're preventing a drop in blood glucose. Think hypoglycemia is a bad thing. So, and because hypoglycemia is a bad thing, it is a bad thing because you've got all these organs that rely on blood glucose to do their job, to produce ATP. So your body has to be very careful about how much blood glucose it actually uses. And it does everything it can to try to maintain a normal concentration of blood glucose. Think there's hormones involved. Insulin and glucagon are involved in regulating blood glucose. You've got free fatty acids being used in the muscle. And take a look at what happens. So using these free fatty acids, let's think about how it spares glycogen. So using these free fatty acids here, by converting free fatty acids, it's called beta oxidation, it's listed there, to acetyl-CoA. Remember, pyruvate gets converted to acetyl-CoA as well. But pyruvate, once upon a time, was glycogen or glucose. So if your fatty acids are being converted to acetyl-CoA, then you don't need to convert as much pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. So I'm going to throw some stuff in here, like I would do on the board. If you're converting acetyl-CoA or fatty acids to acetyl-CoA, of course, these arrows are going to be funky because they're not going to let me. I'm going to make it bright red and bigger, because why not? So if you're converting fatty acids to acetyl-CoA, then you don't need to convert as much pyruvate to acetyl-CoA to ultimately produce ATP. So by using these free fatty acids to produce acetyl-CoA, you basically just signal to the cell that not as much pyruvate needs to be made. And if you don't need as much pyruvate, then you don't need to use as much glucose. So this whole system, let's insert more here. I'm looking for an X, yeah. Then you'll do less of this, right? Bright red. And if you're doing less of that, converting pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, then you need to do less of this, which ultimately spares glucose, right? This graph kind of shows you how that works from rest to exercise. At rest, I don't think I finished this thought on the previous slide, so I'll finish it here. At rest, your muscle is using about half, 50% glucose and 50% free fatty acids to produce ATP. So the purpose of that, again, is to try to spare blood glucose. So it's about half and half. Even more so, the graph is actually kind of showing it's about a 60-40 relationship. Let's go like that for right now. Yep. So you're actually using, while for aerobic ATP production, you're using about a higher percentage of free fatty acids than glucose. So that percentage continues into, here's rest, all the way up to 20 to 40 to 60% of exercise. You're using, and beyond, even up to, close to 70% of max exercise, up to 70% of maximal aerobic exercise intensity. Let's define that. Max aerobic exercise intensity is any exercise intensity that you can perform, let's say the highest exercise intensity that you can perform and sustain for 2 to 3 minutes. Now think about why 2 to 3 minutes. How long does it take for your body to become aerobic? Hopefully you are saying 2 to 3 minutes along with me. So that 2 to 3 minutes, in that first 2 to 3 minutes, your body is anaerobic. So it's taking time to become aerobic. So if you can't sustain the activity for at least 2 to 3 minutes, then it's too high of an intensity. You're anaerobic. And if you can sustain it longer than 2 to 3 minutes, then you're submaximal. So maximal exercise intensity is the highest exercise intensity that you can perform and sustain for 2 to 3 minutes. Think a bout of running that you can run as fast as you can and sustain that run for 2 to 3 minutes. That would be a maximal bout of aerobic exercise. A maximal run at the highest intensity that you can perform and sustain it for 3 minutes. That's max aerobic exercise. So anything longer than that, submaximal. Anything shorter than that, you're anaerobic. So that's what maximum aerobic exercise intensity means when I say that. So if I ever say max aerobic exercise or exercise at maximum, that's what I'm talking about. What you can do and sustain for 2 to 3 minutes. Now, as you get closer to max exercise intensity, you shift from predominantly using free fatty acids to spare blood glucose to a more anaerobic type glucose utilization. So as you get to higher exercise intensity at max exercise intensity, you're using 100% glucose because you need ATP fast. And to do that, you use glycogen and glucose to produce ATP quickly. it takes time for free fatty acids to undergo beta oxidation and get involved in aerobic glycolysis. And because it does take time, if you don't have that time, then your body will start to shift and use more glucose than it does free fatty acids. Okay, so these energy systems, something got shifted there. Let's see what's going on. I don't know why that got shifted. Anyway, the energy systems always work. Even at rest, all three systems are contributing some ATP to your body to continue to work. The amount that is contributed is what changes. So on this particular figure here, I'm not going to blow it up, but basically what it shows you, right there's your immediate ATP PCR system. In the first 30 seconds of exercise, you produce lots of ATP, but it gets depleted really quickly. And then suddenly, your anaerobic glycolytic system starts ramping up and producing more ATP. And that can sustain exercise for about 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes, right? So right around here is the 3-minute mark. Look at how long it's taking for aerobic glycolysis to finally get to the point where ATP production is sustainable, is maximal. Now this is the percent capacity of energy systems. So this 100% is the amount of ATP that needs to be produced. So on the y-axis, at 100% equals the amount of equals ATP is production is sufficient for exercise intensity. So you're keeping ATP production at this value, but the energy systems are declining here, ATP PCR, ramping up while that declines, sufficiently producing ATP for that exercise intensity, but then it has a limit. It can only produce so much ATP per glucose. So that ability declines as you produce more and more lactate, which means over time, in this first 2 to 3 minutes, blood pressure is increasing, cardiac output's increasing, heart rate, stroke volume, ventilation, to the point where you're finally getting to the point where you're producing ATP sufficiently to sustain activity, that particular exercise intensity. So all the systems are working at any given time, but they work together, and only one of them predominantly produces ATP for a given amount of or given intensity of exercise and the amount of time you're performing that exercise. And that's what this kind of just overviews here. It's the energy systems, what fuels, this is a good table, of an overview table. So what substrates, these are fuels, relative ATP production speed, duration at maximal pace, limiting factors, right? Lactic acid accumulation here. Here, a limiting factor would be glycogen depletion, and examples of activities. This is all kind of what we talked about up until this point. So really good summary table. Now let's talk about this in terms of a single bout of exercise. What factors will limit your exercise performance? And in this particular lecture, we're only going to focus on cardiovascular exercise. We'll get to strength training in the next lecture. So I'll probably post both of them, I'm hoping today, but if I don't have time to, then I'll post this one this week, and the next one as early as I can next week. But I'm hoping to get them maybe Sunday. I'll post the next one. I'll figure it out. This one's going to take me a while to get through. So what limits prolonged exercise? So think something that lasts about 40 minutes. 1,500 meter swim, there's a couple of examples. 10K, so 6.2 miles. About 40 minutes, 6.2 miles would take me a little bit longer than 40 minutes, but that's an example of somebody maybe who is more trained than me. Predominant energy system that's producing ATP is aerobic glycolysis. We're talking about, for the rest of today, aerobic exercise, so cardiovascular exercise. But in that first 40 minutes of exercise, what are our limiting factors? The biggest limiting factor is lactate buildup. Even though you're aerobic, lactic acid is still being produced. Your body has an ability to buffer that lactic acid to an extent. So depending on the exercise intensity, we've talked about this equation last week in the respiratory system. Bicarbonate is our buffer, but it has a capacity. So beyond that, you can induce fatigue. So your body's ability to buffer the production of lactic acid is an indication of exercise performance and how well you're able to sustain activity for longer periods of time. So in those limiting factors, you may get a little bit of glycogen depletion, like in the muscle. So where you deplete muscle glycogen first, because it's just it's an easy source. It's right in the muscle. So you won't, but in 40 minutes of exercise, probably not. You won't deplete liver glycogen. It's not a huge limiting factor, but it can be a limiting factor. Mild dehydration if you're not hydrating, and then some mild electrolyte imbalances. So in about 40 minutes of exercise, maybe you want to bring some water with you. Maybe you want to have some electrolytes in you before you go. But really, the big limiting factor is your ability to buffer, and that comes down to your body's production of bicarbonate. With training, your body gets better at that. So let's talk about limiting factors for beyond 40 minutes of exercise. So like distance running or road cycling. Again, the energy system is aerobic glycolysis, but now your big limiting factors are glycogen depletion. So again, the first spots, or the first tissue where you'll deplete glycogen is muscle. First. Then, as muscle glycogen gets depleted, blood glucose has to be, but then blood glucose is now the source of glucose. And when it starts to drop, it's an indication that liver glycogen needs to be depleted. When it drops, liver glycogen. So it's glycogen breakdown is glycogenolysis occurs to sustain blood glucose concentrations. But really what you're doing there is during exercise, glycogen is being broken down. Using free fatty acids prevents glycogen glycolysis, glycogen breakdown, but only so much. So during a bout of exercise that lasts more than 40 minutes, your muscle glycogen stores are being depleted to send glucose into glycolysis and continually run ATP production. Free fatty acids are being used preferentially during exercise to spare that breakdown and prevent that breakdown, so blood glucose doesn't have to be used to produce ATP in the muscle. But over time, think more than 40 minutes, glycogen depletion happens in the muscle. And then when there's no more glycogen in the muscle, the only source of glucose is blood glucose. So as blood glucose then shuttles into the muscle, it starts to drop in the blood. And as it drops in the blood, the liver goes, okay, well, I've got glycogen, so you can have it. So the liver glycogen then gets broken down as well. And as liver glycogen gets broken down, the job of that is to shuttle that glucose into the blood. Well, if you're exercising still, a lot of that glucose continues on into the muscle. So as muscle glycogen gets depleted, you drop blood glucose. Then you tap into liver glycogen. And as liver glycogen gets depleted to try to maintain blood glucose, once it's depleted, you have no other source of glycogen. So blood glucose drops really quickly. After that point, think more than 40 minutes. So a major limiting factor is glycogen depletion that limits exercise. So think when somebody gets fatigued, if muscle and liver glycogen are depleted, then blood glucose drops. I'm going to start abbreviating glucose as GLC to shorten it. Blood glucose drops. You can become hypoglycemic. And that means fatigue is coming. And if you're fatiguing, then you're not going to be able to continue to sustain that exercise. Now, in addition to that, dehydration plays a pretty big role. And as dehydration occurs in longer bouts of exercise, that can cause a drop in blood volume. And a drop in blood volume and compromises stroke volume. If you're compromising stroke volume, you need to maintain cardiac output. And that maintenance of cardiac output is to ensure proper blood flow and oxygen delivery to muscle, then the only way to compensate to maintain cardiac output if stroke volume is dropped is to increase heart rate. And that puts more stress on the heart. Not good, right? Hopefully you were thinking, oh, that's not good. That comes along with increases in body temperature. Increases in body temperature increases CV's cardiovascular demand to improve skin blood flow to try to regulate body temperature. And the drop in blood glucose can cause central nervous system fatigue. So all that's a pretty big deal during longer bouts of exercise. You have to prevent this, you need to fuel properly during exercise. And that means drink water, hopefully with electrolytes, and consume glucose. Some kind of fuel. You got to consume fuel. If you do that, you prevent glycogen breakdown. And ultimately that helps you spare blood glucose. In sports are a whole different bear. You use all energy systems. You're jumping, you're sprinting, you're doing agility type exercises, and you're doing those exercises. Think like a soccer player is going for a 90-minute match. And that 90 minutes, you need to be aerobically trained, but you're also anaerobically trained. You are cutting back and forth, you're jumping, you're stopping, you're starting, you're sprinting, but then you're also jogging. So you're doing a lot. So anything that would limit long-term exercise longer than 40 minutes would be the same limitations as exercise that we talked about on the previous slide. So all of that has to do with limitations. So sports performance are just a completely different world where you just have to be trained in every energy system. And when we're training for our sport, we really are training our energy systems. Let's talk about from here what happens during a single bout of exercise. So initially, right before you start to exercise, you actually have an anticipatory response that is tied to the nervous system. So think sympathetic nervous system. It's your body's way of preparing for exercise. So that anticipatory response starts to increase parameters. It's an anticipation that you're going to need more oxygen. So all of those things that we talked about, the only one we didn't talk about was oxygen extraction, and we will, all start to increase during before exercise. Like an anticipatory response happens when the sympathetic nervous system says, okay, we're about to start exercising. So heart rate increases and ventilation, respiration starts to increase in anticipation. Like, here's more oxygen. Let's try to get more oxygen to the muscle. So that's neural input into basically that from those centers that control respiration. And those centers are like the medulla, and the pons. Both really important. Now, what we'll talk about during exercise is the rest. But first, we're going to talk about oxygen consumption. So really, the job of your body during aerobic exercise, cardiovascular exercise, more old notes, cardiovascular exercise is to make sure that your muscle has enough oxygen to perform and sustain the work you're asking it to do. Now, oxygen consumption is that value that we measure to make sure to say, yes, at this particular workload, you're consuming this much oxygen to do that work. You don't consume more oxygen than you need to perform work or less, just the right amount. So this VO2 is volume of oxygen consumed per minute of time. And it really is the amount of oxygen used by muscles to sustain work at a given workload or exercise intensity. You consume just enough oxygen to perform and sustain that amount of work. You don't consume more, you don't consume less. So the maximum amount, basically VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that can be consumed per minute of time during exercise. It's a rate, so it's in milliliters or liters per minute. Maximum O2 oxygen consumption is measured in milliliters. Well, it can be liters per minute. It's an absolute value. We'll talk about relative VO2 here shortly. So it's an indication of exercise capacity or aerobic capacity. Think the more work you need to do, more work you need, more oxygen. For example, if you run a 9-minute mile for 36 minutes, I don't know, you'll run about 4 miles, right? If you run that same 4 mile, like that, if you're able to do that, you will consume exactly enough oxygen to sustain a 9-minute mile for the duration of the run. You don't consume more oxygen than you need to run that pace or less. You consume just enough. So you're consuming O2 to produce enough ATP to sustain that 9-minute mile. If you need to run an 8-minute mile, then you need to consume more O2. At a faster pace, you're doing more work, which means you need to consume more oxygen. So for a given amount of work, you need to consume a given amount of O2. This is very important, and we will come back to this over and over and over and over again. So I'm going to do that to it. See if it'll let me. Nope, just bold and underlined. So for a given amount of work, you will consume a given amount of oxygen. That's it. So on this graph here, you've got these values at different exercise intensities. That is the VO2 oxygen consumption at that exercise intensity that you need to consume to perform that amount of work. And if this is a test of someone who's increasing exercise intensity, like what we're going to do next week when we measure physiological parameters during a bout of cardiovascular exercise, we'll see as exercise intensity increases, we won't measure oxygen consumption, but we'll measure other things that indicate oxygen consumption to an extent. We won't reach VO2 max next week, but we will predict it using other things like submaximal heart rate. So a couple of things happening here. We have a VO2 max value, and this VO2 max value is our best indication. VO2 max is the best indication of cardiovascular fitness that we have. So someone with a higher VO2 max is more cardiovascularly fit. So think someone who is a trained athlete, who's a runner, a cycler, a swimmer, would have a very high VO2 max compared to somebody who's not. And that VO2 max measurement is actually measured in relative form. So relative VO2 is now normalized to body weight, so that the units are in milliliters per kilogram per minute. So we can take absolute VO2. Let me take, where's absolute VO2? In liters per minute. And convert it to relative VO2. So say, for example, the absolute VO2 is called absolute VO2 because it's oxygen consumption per whole body. So a bigger person who has more tissue consumes more O2 just to stay alive. So it's not a very good measurement of, not a good value to use to compare to individuals. Because two people, one smaller, one bigger, will consume wildly different amounts of oxygen because the larger body will consume more O2 just to stay alive. So if you're trying to compare oxygen consumption between two people, you have to normalize it to body weight, which is where relative VO2 comes in. So relative VO2 is basically just converting VO2 in liters per minute, multiplying it by 1 over body weight, and then converting it to milliliters. So you've got 1,000 milliliters in a liter. So say, for example, we had 5 liters per minute. I don't know, I'm just making up numbers. To convert to relative VO2, so we're gonna go, let's just do it like this. Calculator. Boo. It won't let me do it. Oh, maybe it will. Okay, so we'll go 5. I'm going to say this person maybe weighs 70 kilograms for, yeah, just for argument's sake. 5 times, whoops. No, okay, we'll find it. We'll go by times 1,000 and then divide by body weight. So their relative VO2, if it'll let me see it, is 71.42 milliliters per kilogram per minute. This would be a really, really good, highly trained VO2 max value. So converting absolute VO2 to relative VO2 is really important to compare two individuals. So, you know, of different body sizes. Maybe they both had, maybe that was a larger person and a smaller person had, 3 liters per minute. And if you multiply by 1, this is a smaller person, maybe, let's call them 50 kilograms. I hope this works out. I'm making up numbers. If not, I'm gonna have to go back. Milliliters per liter. Relative VO2. Oh, come on, work out. I'm gonna do this on my computer. 3 divided by 50 times, I can't see that. Hold please. 60, darn. I'm gonna change these numbers around a little bit. Try to get these numbers so the example I want to use works out. I'm going to do the calculation on my phone because the computer's not cooperating. So 5 liters per minute divided by 80 is 62.5. And down here is 3 divided by, what did I say, 45 times 1,000 is 66. That works out better. 66.7 milliliters per kilogram per minute. More trained, more fit, right? So even a smaller person, this 45 kilograms smaller person, will have a smaller absolute, a lower absolute VO2. They're just a smaller person, but they may be more cardiovascularly fit. So we can say per kilogram of body weight, this is how much oxygen this person is consuming. Even though this person's bigger, they're only consuming this much oxygen per kilogram of body weight, which means this individual is more trained. So hopefully that makes sense. Thank you for letting me fumble through that. And on we go. So in a trained individual, let's talk about what this graph would look like if this happened to be untrained. Now let's make them trained. So let's go back here and insert shape. Okay, so let's go like this. I'm gonna make this guy red and a little bit larger. So in a trained individual, here's what VO2 would look like. So likely, as long as this individual didn't change their body weight, here's what my graph would look like in a trained individual. For every exercise intensity, VO2 is exactly the same. let's talk about why VO2 is exactly the same. VO2 is exactly the same because for a given amount of work, where did it go? For a given amount of work, you need to consume a given amount of oxygen. That doesn't change with exercise training. The amount of work that you're doing doesn't change. That 9-minute mile is still a 9-minute mile. And if you need to keep that pace, your body, your whole body needs to consume, per kilogram of body weight, your body needs to consume just enough oxygen to sustain that work. So this exercise slope after training won't look any different. But what will is how much work you can do. And if you're doing more work, then you're consuming more oxygen. So eventually this graph will look something like this. Imagine that plateaued off because it's not cooperating wonderfully in the world of these. So as opposed to this plateauing at a lower exercise intensity, that trained individual can just now do more work. So you won't see the plateau in VO2 happen until later, until higher exercise intensities. So this workload is the red line is a trained individual versus untrained. The only thing that this graph here is showing you is that here it takes about 2 to 3 minutes or so at the start of exercise to reach a value called steady state. And that steady state value is that value at which oxygen consumption is optimal and sufficient for a particular exercise intensity. So each of these points on this graph is a steady state value. So let me make that note quickly. Go up here. Every point on the right graph equals steady state value for O2 consumption. And that steady state value just basically is an indication that, yes, you're sufficiently consuming oxygen to produce that, to sustain that amount of work. So a steady state value for oxygen consumption is necessary to be measured, because if you measure oxygen consumption at the start of that exercise intensity, then you're still increasing oxygen consumption to a certain extent and to a certain amount. So you have to measure steady state values during exercise, and we'll do that next week. So we'll measure them at between 2 to 3 minutes. So we'll do a bout of light exercise and a bout of heavy exercise on the bike next week. And that bout of light exercise, we will have our subject exercise for 3 minutes or so. In the minutes between 2 to 3 minutes, we will take measurements like blood pressure, heart rate. We'll take a look at the EKG. We'll measure tidal volume, things like that. So all those values have to be steady state values, so that we are sure that we're getting an accurate value for that particular exercise intensity. Okay. So from this point forward, we're going to start talking about exercise training over time, so adaptation to exercise. So during a single bout of exercise, oxygen consumption will go up during exercise, but what happens over time? So for every other cardiorespiratory parameter that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what happens with that exercise parameter during a single bout of exercise. So does it go up? Does it go down? Does it change? How does it work? But then we'll talk about how that parameter changes with adaptations to exercise. So how does your body adapt to exercise training? With regard to VO2, over time, oxygen consumption in a resting individual, whether they're trained or untrained, doesn't change. It depends on body size. So resting VO2 stays the same with training. So let's think about why. And it's listed on the next bullet point. So resting VO2, let's go, and submaximal VO2 stays the same with training, because a given amount of work requires a given amount of VO2, like we mentioned on the previous slide, but we're going to add to that. To get enough oxygen to the muscle, cardiac output has to increase, and cardiac output will only increase to a certain extent, to the exact amount where oxygen delivery is sufficient. So we're going to say which requires a given amount of cardiac output. So this is what I've been kind of alluding to on the last slide, a certain amount of work, a certain exercise intensity, a 9-minute mile, for example, that exercise intensity requires your whole body to consume a certain amount of oxygen to sustain that exercise intensity. You won't consume more, you won't consume less, you'll consume just the right amount. With exercise training, over time, that pace, that 9-minute mile, that amount of work doesn't change. So your body will still only consume just enough oxygen to sustain a 9-minute mile. So at resting exercise, at rest and at submaximal exercise intensities, remember submaximal exercise intensities means, hold on with that. Submax means not max. So you can sustain it for more than 3 minutes. Right? Now, maximal VO2, because a trained individual can do more work, will be higher with exercise training. So here, VO2 max, higher in trained, because trained individuals can do more work. And if you do more work, requires more O2. And a given amount of work requires a given amount of oxygen, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. So if you do more work, you change from a 9-minute mile to an 8-minute mile pace, oxygen consumption goes up during a single bout of exercise. But with exercise training, an 8-minute mile is an 8-minute mile. So whether you're trained or untrained, those two individuals will consume the same amount of oxygen to perform that same amount of work. But at maximal exercise intensities, a trained individual can do more work. So the max exercise intensity for a trained person is higher. So think if you're untrained and you can run an 8-minute mile, but a trained individual can run a 7-minute mile. That 7-minute mile is doing more work. It's a faster pace. So to do that, you need to consume more oxygen. So the trained individual has to consume more oxygen to do more work. And that increase in VO2 max, how much it can increase, completely depends on where you start. So somebody who is previously untrained has way more to gain than somebody who is already trained. Genetics play a factor, and so does age and type of training. So think if you're a runner and you want to improve your VO2 max, then you run. But if you're a swimmer, then you swim. Anaerobically training doesn't really help VO2 max improve much, but it can facilitate it. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. With cardiovascular training, to just minimally improve VO2 max in a healthy young adult, you need to exercise. Think cardiovascular exercise that's relatively taxing, intense to you, at least 15 minutes a day at about 60% of VO2 max. We'll talk about how to estimate that later, at least 3 days a week. To improve it in an older adult, you need even less. And in elite athletes, you need way more. So this drives home the point here on this slide that to improve VO2 max, or being able to, the ability to improve VO2 max completely depends on where you start. And more trained individuals need to do more work to improve VO2 max. Whereas untrained or older individuals don't need as much to just see small gains, to see bigger gains. So in response to exercise, in response to a single bout, old stuff, don't even know what that means. In response to a single bout of exercise, we said, what's heart rate? How fast the heart beats, right? It's the how fast. The units are beats per minute. And a typical resting heart rate is around 70 beats per minute, but a max value is around, it depends, because max heart rate is dependent upon age. There's age as well. So all of this is dependent upon age. Really, cardiovascular exercise will have very little to no impact on maximal heart rate. Now, maximal heart rate is achieved at max exercise intensities. So remember that. Max heart rate is attained at max exercise intensities. Remember, sustainable for 2 to 3 minutes. So think about it. If someone is trained and untrained, there's no difference in max heart rate. It's completely dependent upon age. So acutely during exercise, heart rate goes up, right? So it increases. Why? To increase blood flow to muscle, which increases O2 delivery, because more work requires more O2, right? A given amount of work requires a given amount of oxygen, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. In response to exercise training, heart rate at rest goes down. Think an athletic heart. Why does heart rate at rest in trained decreases? Why? Don't answer you can answer the why right now, but we're going to answer the why on the next couple slides. So it says, hint, what happens to stroke volume? At submaximal exercise intensities, anything longer than submax is longer than 3 minutes. In a trained individual, heart rates are lower. Why? But at max, what's sustainable for 2 to 3 minutes, heart rate, no change, because it's dependent upon what? Age. So now heart rate at max. So take a look at this graph here. Heart rate max, relatively the same. This is an untrained person and a trained person. Purple before training, yellow after training. In this trained individual, look, heart rate at rest and every single submaximal exercise intensity lower. Now look at the maximal exercise intensity for the untrained individual. Here, this max exercise, this is oxygen consumption. VO2 is an indication in a lot of graphs of exercise intensity. Why, guys? Because a given amount of work requires a given amount of oxygen consumption. So oxygen consumption, as it increases, indicates exercise intensity is increasing, more work. So the max exercise intensity, or max VO2 max here, in this untrained individual is only about 32 mils per kg per minute. The max VO2 once this person is trained, upwards of 40. So they're able to do more work. If they're able to do more work, they're going to meet the same heart rate max. They'll just reach that heart rate max at a greater workload, a greater VO2. So heart rate max does not change with exercise training, but you reach that heart rate max at a higher exercise intensity because that person can do more work. Now, let's talk about stroke volume. Stroke volume, it's the amount of blood pumped out of the heart in, I don't know, 1 cardiac cycle. Every time it beats, right? Units are milliliters of blood per, let's call it beat, because heart rate is beats per minute. This is milliliters per beat. So we got per beat. In a typical resting individual, it's about 60 to 80 milliliters per contraction per cardiac cycle, but it can increase up to 200. So you can more than double stroke volume during exercise. And acutely during exercise, it increases. We know that. But in response to exercise training, what happens? In response to training, the heart gets stronger. The outer ventricular wall thickens. It means it's stronger and contracts more forcefully. As well, the left ventricular chamber size increases, which means the ventricle fills with more blood. Now remember, how do we calculate stroke volume? End diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So if the outer wall, let's go left ventricular wall thickness increases and the muscle gets stronger, contracts more forcefully, then what variable does that impact? End systolic volume or end diastolic volume? So the outer wall is thicker, it contracts more forcefully. If the ventricle is contracting more forcefully, the wall is, will that affect end diastolic volume or end systolic volume? Good. If the chamber size increases, left ventricular chamber size increases, and the heart and ventricle fills with more blood, then what happens? Increases. Both increase stroke volume. So in response to exercise training, even at rest, stroke volumes are higher. Remember we said what happens with heart rate? Heart rate's lower and stroke volume is higher. Whoops, how did that happen? So what does that do to cardiac output? Think about that for a second. During submaximal exercise intensities, heart rate's also lower, but stroke volume is higher because the wall is thicker, it's stronger, the chamber fills with more blood. Stroke volume is higher in trained individuals at rest and during submaximal exercise intensities when heart rate is lower. Now, heart rate becomes lower because of the increase in stroke volume. So remember, think again, what does that do to cardiac output? We're about to talk about it. At max exercise intensity, what happens to heart rate? Hopefully you said no change. Yeah, because heart rate max is dependent upon age. As you get older, heart rate max declines. That's all there is to it. Sorry, guys. But at max exercise intensities in a trained individual, stroke volume is higher. So take a look here. Purple is trained. These are endurance athletes. Sadly, these are sedentary college students. Before and after training, though, so that's good. Before training, really low stroke volumes. But at rest, submaximal exercise intensities, right around here, we're getting towards max, right? Rest, submaximal exercise intensities, max. Rest, all of this is submaximal, max. Way more work. If you have more work to do, then you need more oxygen. And if you need more oxygen, then you need more cardiac output, which is contributed to by way of stroke volume. So at max exercise intensities, when this individual is able to do more work and needs more oxygen and consequently needs more cardiac output and heart rate has leveled off at max in trained, when heart rate depends on age to increase Q, stroke volume increases. That's really important. We'll talk about it again on the next slide. So just know for right now, at rest and at submaximal exercise intensities, in a trained individual, heart rate goes down, whereas stroke volume goes up. In a trained individual at max exercise intensities, heart rate is the same because it's dependent upon age, but stroke volume increases. So ultimately, if heart rate's the same and stroke volume increases, then cardiac output goes up. Because if you do more work, you need more oxygen. If you need more oxygen, cardiac output has to go up. And to do that at max exercise intensities, stroke volume increases. So that's what it says here. What is cardiac output? The amount of blood pumped out of the heart per minute of time. Go and see if I can do that and not screw up with my slide. Kind of. Okay. What are the units? Milliliters of blood per minute or liters per minute. Let's go liters because that's what it is below. Typical resting value is about 5, but that can go up to 25, even to 25 to 40 liters per minute during exercise. And acutely, it increases. I don't know what that means. Q goes up during exercise to meet the demands of oxygen. Because a given amount of work requires a given amount of oxygen, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. So because heart rate times stroke volume is cardiac output, let's talk about the adaptations in cardiac output. Does it on here? How are heart rate and stroke volume? Yeah, okay. How are stroke, again, we know this, we've talked about this in the cardiovascular unit for exam 2. Maybe some of you are working on your corrections right now. But some of the things that we've been talking about. At rest, in response to exercise training, cardiac output doesn't change. Q stays the same because a given amount of work requires a given amount of oxygen, which requires a given amount of carbon dioxide, cardiac output. So VO2, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. So in a trained individual at rest, Q stays the same. But what are the adaptations that occur? Because stroke volume has increased and heart rate decreases. So cardiac output stays the same. Same thing goes for submaximal exercise intensities. At submax, at rest, and submaximal exercise intensities, because a given amount of work requires a given amount of VO2, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. So if you're doing a certain amount of work, you only need to consume a certain amount of oxygen to do that work. So resting and submaximal cardiac outputs are the same. Stroke volume has increased and heart rate has decreased to compensate and maintain cardiac output. But in a trained individual at max, that person can do more work. And if more work requires more O2, more volume of oxygen consumed per minute of time, which means cardiac output has to go up. How? Heart rate depends on age. So heart rate at max stays the same. The only way for cardiac output to go up, increase with training at max is due to increases in stroke volume. As the hearts become stronger, fills with more blood, gets better at its job. So the major adaptation here is cardiac output has increased at maximal exercise intensities, not due to heart rate, but because of stroke volume. So stroke volume is a major contributing factor to the increase in cardiac output at max exercise intensities. So let's talk about outside of that, distribution of blood flow during exercise. So during exercise, look at the shift. Cardiac output, this is Q at rest, cardiac output at rest. Look at this nice laid back resting lady. So that cardiac output at rest, about 13% heads to the brain. So this is basically showing you like where what percentage of this 5.8 liters per minute is headed to each organ. The muscle gets about 20%, so a good amount. Digestive system, 25%, kidneys about 20%. So you send almost half of cardiac output to the kidney and the digestive system at rest. But take a look at this during exercise, 25 liters per minute. So cardiac output in general goes up, which means blood flow during exercise goes up everywhere. So blood flow to all tissues goes up during exercise. You never limit blood flow to any tissue, but the percentages change. To direct blood to muscle that needs a lot of oxygen, right? Upwards of 88% of cardiac output can go to muscle during max exercise. It's a big deal. Muscles really need it. It needs a lot of oxygen. It needs to produce a lot of ATP to sustain work. So if you're just sending more blood out of the heart per minute at a time, look at these other tissues. Like your GI system goes from 24% to 1%. Kidney goes from 20% to 1%. You send about the same amount to the heart. So more blood makes it to the heart no matter what. Again, the heart's involved in cardiovascular exercise. It needs more blood, so it gets it. But you basically vasodilate muscle, heart, lungs, and vasoconstrict to all other tissues during exercise. Maybe not skin, but yeah, do a little bit to direct blood to tissues critical, vital to exercise. So blood flow changes during a single bout of exercise. Not only does heart rate and stroke volume go up during exercise to increase cardiac output, but that increase in cardiac output gets redirected to where it's needed most, think skeletal muscle, during exercise. That distribution of blood flow is also kind of listed here, 80 to 80%. So at rest, it's got about 20%. So these are kind of ballpark numbers. Submaximal exercise, you increase that percentage to about 50 to 60%. And then max exercise, you can go up to 80 to 90% of cardiac output. 88% is sent to skeletal muscle. And that depends. That changes with training, but slightly. So this slide, I was yawning. It's been a long day, guys. This slide is just kind of showing you what happens with peripheral resistance because of vasodilation. Remember, during exercise, total peripheral resistance doesn't change a ton. It may go down a little bit. So you may go in millimeters of mercury down ever so slightly. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide than the previous one. So remember, systolic blood pressure goes way up during exercise, whereas diastolic blood pressure doesn't really change a whole lot. So mean arterial pressure is what is increasing, as we can remember. So mean arterial pressure is, you can calculate it a couple of ways. So diastolic blood pressure, I think what I had on my slides was plus 1/3 of systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. So the major contributing factor to changes in mean arterial pressure is diastolic, but because systolic goes up pretty drastically during exercise, mean arterial pressure does from rest at about 99.3, it's like 93 point, like about, it's around 95 millimeters of mercury ballpark, to exercise at about 100 millimeters of mercury, something like that, 100 to 105. Can go higher than that. It's kind of showing you max exercise there. Max exercise, so submaximal exercise about 100 to 105. As you get to higher exercise intensities, some of the vasodilation, vasoconstriction things happen. Muscle exercise or muscle intensity of contraction also changes, and that can change blood peripheral resistance as well. But 100, let's say 100 plus millimeters of mercury, depending on the intensity of exercise. So that increase in mean arterial pressure is what's indicating that blood flow in general and perfusion is increasing to tissues, muscle particularly. Whoops, too far. Now, ultimately, all of this was to get to the point, let me see where I'm at, okay. All of this was to get to the point where we can say the heart is now pumping out more blood, and blood vessels are now dilating to skeletal muscle. I don't know what these old notes are. May not even be mine. So to now, we've covered the fact that cardiac output increases and how to deliver more O2 to the muscle. Vasodilation occurs drastically to also ensure greater O2 delivery to muscle. Now it's the muscle's job to extract more, extract O2 out of blood. And that oxygen extraction increases during exercise. How much O2, I'm going to call it extracted, but that's a bad way to put it. How much oxygen is removed from blood? That's arterial blood. And transported into muscle, maybe a better way to put it. Move that guy out of the way. How is it measured? It's measured in milliliters of O2 per 100 milliliters of blood. And in response to exercise, it increases. So let's talk about that value and how we measure it. So it's in milliliters of oxygen extracted per 100 milliliters of blood. 100 milliliters is also a deciliter. Okay, so let's talk about that. In the arterial blood, I'm going to put a box around this to kind of help highlight some things. These values are important. So I'm going to do that. No shape fill. Okay, so this 20 milliliters per deciliter of blood, 100 milliliters of blood, is consistent. Take a look in the arterial blood during exercise, right? During exercise, it doesn't change. Arterial O2 content is very stable. Your lungs are really good at sending enough oxygen into the lungs to get that to the arterial blood, and the arterial blood is very good at transporting oxygen. So the oxygen content in the arteries is very stable. So to ensure enough O2 delivery, so your arteries are always saying to the muscle, here, you have as much oxygen as you need. Take as much as you want. The muscle then extracts as much as it needs. So take a look at rest. It's called an AVO2 difference. It's arterial venous oxygen content difference. And it's, again, in milliliters per deciliter of blood. So in a resting individual, that the value, the arterial venous oxygen content difference, is only about 5 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. So if you're only removing 5 milliliters and sending it to the muscle to be used, you leave behind in the veins 15. Now, during exercise, your muscle needs more oxygen. If this value doesn't change, the arterial oxygen content, 20 milliliters per deciliter of blood, to extract more, the muscle just takes more out and leaves less behind. So you can go all the way down to 2 milliliters per deciliter of blood in the venous side of circulation, which means you've extracted out, your oxygen extraction is a value of 18. So these values at rest are about 5, and during exercise can go all the way up to 18 during max exercise. So those values are really important. So understand that the arterial oxygen content is always stable. It's 20 milliliters per deciliter of blood. Add that 20 milliliters per deciliter of blood. Remember, when we talked about the respiratory system, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury, and hemoglobin saturation is 100%. EO2 equals 100 millimeters of mercury, and hemoglobin saturation equals about 100%, right? So think in a resting individual, on the venous side of circulation, where the partial pressure of O2 is like 40 millimeters of mercury. What's going on? I hit caps lock. No, I didn't. And hemoglobin saturation is like 75%. You've got 15 milliliters per deciliter blood of oxygen. But that completely changes here. So remember, during exercise, these values go down. During exercise, venous values change, not arterial. So the venous values go down from rest to exercise to like 2 milliliters of mercury, or milliliters per deciliter of blood. And perhaps hemoglobin saturation goes down to like a partial pressure of 20, and hemoglobin saturation would go down to a percentage of like 40 or 60. So those values all decrease. How much it decreases completely depends on exercise intensity and the training status of the individual. So oxygen extraction is super important. You should be able to calculate it, but also be able to describe how it changes during exercise from rest, from about 5 milliliters per deciliter of blood to all the way up to max exercise. And in between rest and maximal is submaximal. So those values can change. And what values change are not on the arterial side, they're on the venous side of circulation. So there's another oxygen extraction at rest in a trained individual doesn't change. Again, you don't only need so much oxygen to survive. So you won't modify that value. At submaximal exercise intensities, it actually does increase in a trained individual. And there's a couple of reasons why. And those reasons why at both submaximal exercise intensities and max. At max exercise intensities, you just need more oxygen because you're doing more work. If you need more oxygen because you're doing more work, then you extract more out. The muscle at max extracts more O2 out because it's using more O2 to produce more ATP to do more work. At submax exercise intensities, O2 extraction increases as well, despite that for a given amount of work, a given amount of oxygen is required, which requires a given amount of cardiac output. And that happens because for a number of reasons. Capillary density increases, and your body gets better at directing blood flow to the muscle. So you're able to better dilate and constrict certain vessels to direct and send blood flow to those vessels. You increase capillary density, which increases oxygenated blood flow. You deliver more, so your muscle is able to extract more out. So also inside the muscle, oxidative capacity increases. And that means it increases because you produce more mitochondria. Mitochondria increase in size and number. That means more O2 used to produce ATP. More myoglobin is available, equals more O2 stored in the muscle. And in that same mitochondrial oxidative enzyme production and capacity increases, which means ATP produced using O2. So all three of those factors allow the muscle itself to use more oxygen. If the muscle is using more O2 during exercise, there's a couple things that happen. Then more O2 needs extracted. So O2 in intramuscular decreases, which increases the gradient to drive O2 in. That means more O2 extracted. There's another point I wanted to make there. More myoglobin. If the muscle is using more O2 during exercise, then more O2 needs to be extracted. So intramuscular O2 decreases, which increases the gradient to drive oxygen into the muscle. It's good for now. I thought I wanted to say something else, but I don't remember what it was. More myoglobin, more mitochondrial enzyme capacity, more mitochondria. Really, that's all there is to it. More mitochondria and an increase in size and their capacity to produce ATP aerobically means that the muscle itself is using more oxygen. And if the muscle is using more oxygen, then the intramuscular content of oxygen is decreasing, which increases the gradient to allow oxygen to be extracted and driven into the muscle from the blood. And we can use our physiological parameters like VO2. We can calculate VO2 by using cardiac output and that oxygen extraction, that value of oxygen extraction. So cardiac output is delivery of oxygenated blood. And then O2 difference is extraction of O2. So how much are we getting to the muscle, and then how much is the muscle actually taking? So both of those values can be used to calculate VO2. So if we have an indication of how much O2 is making it to the muscle, and then how much O2 is actually removed from that, we can calculate VO2. It's called the Fick equation. So you should be able to take end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, and heart rate and calculate cardiac output, something you've likely already done in this class. And then I will potentially give you an arterial and venous oxygen content in milliliters per deciliter of blood and ask you to calculate VO2. So let's do that. Let's say let's go cardiac output. Let's go stroke volume is 60 milliliters per beat. Let's go here, stroke volume and heart rate. Let's go make it easy, 60 beats per minute. Let's go arterial O2 is 20 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. And then venous O2 is, I don't know. Let's use this to typical milliliters, milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. So let's calculate our AVO2 difference first. Or actually, screw it. Cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, which is equal to 60 times 60. We're going to do it right because I asked you to put in units. Milliliters, 60 beats per minute, and milliliters per beat. And that is equal to, 3,600 milliliters per minute. So let's go, let's keep it in milliliters for right now. We'll convert it to liters per minute when we're done. Liters per minute. Now we've got oxygen AVO2 difference is equal to 20 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood minus 15 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood, which is equal to 5 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. So we got to convert to get this to milliliters, which is just 5 divided by 100. Did you do it? 0.05 milliliters, right? So it's just, it can actually just be 0.05 milliliters, and that's milliliters of oxygen, O2, per milliliter of blood. So we can't really, I'm not going to really cancel these out just yet. So to calculate VO2, we've got cardiac output, which is 3,600 milliliters per minute, times our AVO2 difference, which is 0.05 milliliters of O2 per milliliter of blood. You have to convert that to milliliters from the deciliters, guys. So pay attention to that. So let's calculate it. 3,600 times 0.05 is 180. And we've got milliliters of blood. Those cancel out. We've got milliliters, milliliters of O2 per minute, which is a VO2, it's a rate, which is equal to, this is resting, so it's really low actually, which is 180 divided by Yeah, 0.18, so really low. That's okay. Liters of O2 per minute of time. Resting VO2s are not quite, well, I guess they could be that low, but not quite that low. Let's mess around with that. That's okay. We can leave it there. Be able to calculate that. I will likely give you numbers that are higher than that, but or leave it in milliliters, 180 milliliters of oxygen per minute of time. That's a good rest, an okay resting VO2. Absolute. We can convert it. I may ask you to take that absolute VO2 and convert it to a relative. So you'd have milliliters per kilogram per minute. So if we convert that resting absolute VO2, this is absolute. The relative, maybe we go, make sure I'm not, I don't want italics, I don't want underline. Okay. We'd have 180. We already have it in milliliters per minute. So we just have to multiply by 1 divided by kilograms of body weight. I don't know, 60 kgs. So what's 180? Yep, I should know this. It's, nope, not times. It should be 3. Yeah, that's actually good. Kilograms, yeah. Equals 3 mLs per kg per minute. And this is relative VO2. This happens to be a pretty decent resting relative VO2. This was resting. In milliliters, you have 180 milliliters per minute. Again, it's the units are milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is milliliters of oxygen consumed per minute of time. Divided by body weight to make it relative as opposed to absolute. And a typical resting VO2 value is about 3 to 3.5 mils per kg per minute. So that's pretty decent. I did that off the top of my head. Yay. All right. So be able to calculate that. That's important. The ABO2 difference, that's just another way to kind of look at it. The resting ABO2 difference is about 5 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. Again, this Fick equation in a trained individual versus untrained, it gives you some values at max exercise. The more trained you are, again, your oxygen extraction comes down to mitochondrial density and size, oxidative capacity, and anything that determines end-diastolic volume will determine stroke volume. Remember Frank Starling's mechanism that we talked about. So with exercise training, blood volume increases, so end-diastolic volume increases, which increases cardiac output. If you're increasing cardiac output, you're increasing potentially the VO2. Yeah, you got a lot going on. Well, again, cardiac output at rest won't change much, but during exercise, it can change pretty drastically. Lastly, in the cardiovascular system, blood composition also changes in response to exercise training. So total blood volume increases with training, but the composition is what's most important, but the composition changes as well. You increase red blood cell numbers. Also, hemoglobin content per red blood cell with exercise training. This increases oxygen carrying or transport capacity, super important. But also with the increase in blood volume, the increase in red blood cell content isn't a negative thing, it's a positive thing, but you increase plasma volume even more, which decreases viscosity of blood, ultimately making it easier for blood to flow. Really, really important. Less resistance to blood flow means there's less stress on the heart, and that it ensures just really efficient and good blood flow to the muscle, especially during exercise. Now, we only spend a slide or two on ventilation because the lungs are never a limiting factor to cardiovascular exercise because of everything we talked about last week, because of big surface area, think thin respiratory membrane, low resistance to airflow, So ventilation is not a limiting, lungs are never a limiting factor to exercise for a number of reasons. Your heart is the limiting factor. So what is minute ventilation? Minute ventilation is respiratory rate times tidal volume. Yeah, we'll leave it like that, right? If you wanted to calculate it. Minute ventilation is how much air is moved into and out of lungs per minute of time. The units are, it's breaths per minute. Times liters per breath. I'm going to stretch that out a little bit. Here we go. So it's either liters or milliliters per minute, liters per minute. And acutely to exercise, obviously ventilation increases. Over time, though, you do still adapt. Ventilation doesn't usually limit exercise capacity because the lungs are just really good at their job. There's a huge surface area. There's very little resistance to airflow, so ventilation is really easy. The thin respiratory membrane and the fact that oxygen and carbon dioxide are soluble in liquid and air, but also fat soluble, they can easily diffuse across the respiratory membrane into or out of the blood. So the lungs are really good at their job. It's just, it has to do with how much oxygen your blood's able to carry and how much blood your heart can get to the lungs. So the limiting factor is really your heart. So what limits exercise capacity? Not the lungs, but heart, because heart can only pump so much blood so fast, and the blood can only carry so much oxygen. So there's limiting factors there that have nothing to do with the lungs, everything to do with the cardiovascular system. So in response to exercise training, minute ventilation actually increases in response to exercise acutely, but over time, maximum minute ventilation absolutely increases, because if you're doing more work, you need more oxygen. If you need more oxygen, ventilation is driven up. But it doesn't usually limit exercise. You increase tidal volume. So in response to exercise training, trained equals tidal volume increases. So you breathe more air with each breath. Think, breathe deeper. Which means muscles are less likely fatigued, less likely to fatigue, and you don't have to breathe as many times per minute. Just like in the heart. Stroke volume goes up, so heart rate can go down. So the similar adaptations occur, just to a lesser extent, because again, the lungs are just really good at their job, even in an untrained individual. So increases in minute ventilation during exercise increase your ability to exhale carbon dioxide. So really, the increase in ventilation during exercise happens because CO2 production goes up. That's where the drive comes from. Think the chemoreceptors. Parotid and aortic bodies signal to medulla and pons to increase ventilation. All right. So in saying that, I feel like we just did a lot in a little bit of time. But I'm gonna put this video on YouTube and then e-learning. So I will send you guys an email and let you know that it's there. If you're listening to this, you already know that. But we're gonna save that, and I will post those slides there as well. So for now, I'm gonna go, and I'm going to stop that. I will see you in the strength training talk. So hopefully I'll get a chance to post both of those today, but I'm not sure I'm going to have a chance to do both. It's getting a little bit later, and I've got to pack and get to a wedding tomorrow. So I may end up doing this on Sunday, but I will do my best. Actually, no, an A&P lab needs this laptop. So I got to go for today, guys. But I will post the strength lecture as soon as I can. Have a great weekend. I will see you soon.